Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about my case study and my presentation for Module 9. Let's get right into it. So, in order to begin working towards a solution, I have to know the whole situation. Who is involved? What happened? We've got Richard, who is the assistant principal. James is a student with a history of poor behavior. A fifth period teacher who identified David as a participant. David is an honor roll student who was in possession of a weapon. School police officer, strict adherence to policy. Director of secondary education also showed a strict adherence to policy. Here's what happened. During fifth period, Richard called James to the office in order to discuss James's third tardy that week. His behavior was not at all surprising, as his list of incidents at school was long, despite a current trend to the contrary. James's fifth period teacher immediately called Richard following James's departure to report that she had seen James giving something, possibly drugs, to another student, David, on his way to the office. David, an honor roll student, has no history of behavior problems. Richard asked the school police officer to go get David and bring him to the office. With those two students and the police officer present, Richard asked what happened. James admitted to giving something to David to hold while he was in the office. When Richard asked David about it, he started crying and refused to speak. The officer searched David and found brass knuckles. Following the discovery, the officer handcuffed David, despite James admitting they were his and that David had nothing to do with the situation. As a result of James's admission and David had possession, both students were taken to jail for possession of a prohibited weapon on school grounds. The school has a zero tolerance policy that stipulates a mandatory 45-day expulsion into the disciplinary alternative action program for policy violations such as this one. Richard completed the paperwork for James, but refused to do that for David. He just wanted to protect his student's future. 1 week later, James was in the program and David was in school as if nothing happened. That day, Richard was called by the director of secondary education, who told him to complete the paperwork on David. Richard explained the situation and why he didn't feel comfortable with complying. The director acknowledged that, but informed him that he should follow policy anyway, and that if he didn't comply, he would be forced to write Richard an official reprimand that would remain in his personnel file. In order to evaluate the ethical dimensions of the issue, a close examination of the possible law violations, breaches of contract, discrimination, and harassment is necessary to begin working towards a solution to those wrongs. Rule violations. It's clear that the students were technically in violation of the law. Despite the fact that nobody was hurt, both students were in some point possession of an authorized weapon on school property. Not punishing David is where Richard violated school policy. Richard did act in a discriminatory fashion when deciding to move forward with punishing James and not David. Breach of contract. I don't really see any breach of contract on the actions of the district. However, Richard could be considered in breach of contract by not following the zero tolerance policy. Gray area. There is a legitimate gray area in this case that every educator could use to advocate for a more ethical decision regarding the legitimacy of enforcing the policy in that situation. David was in the wrong place at the wrong time. However, he did take the weapon and keep it in possession instead of immediately reporting it to a staff member. So he is at fault in the situation as well. However, the gravity of that fault and the necessity to punish him for it is the gray area. What happened? A clear and concise description of the situation provides a better overall grasp of that situation. Here's what happened. Richard is faced with a moral dilemma that has the potential to negatively impact his career or the future of a promising student, which is to punish a student that had a very small role in a very big problem, or face formal reprimand in his professional dossier. The facts. A description of the relevant facts surrounding the situation helps narrow down the details. Every person involved, in this case, displayed an attempt to act ethically at some point in the situation. Richard just wanted to protect his student from unjust punishment. James attempted to protect David by shifting blame onto himself and admitting his own guilt. David kept possession of the weapon in secret in order to protect James. The teacher just wanted to report her observation to keep her school safe. Police officer did the same thing by following the law. And the director of secondary education just wanted to help the district avoid potential legal ramifications by insisting that Richard adhere to the zero tolerance policy. Place. This is definitely a suburban town in which a clearly diverse population lives, and it's a divided town. There are the haves on one side of the tracks and the have-nots on the other. The barriers in place limit the upward mobility of the residents, and one of the only ways to overcome those barriers is a good education. And the program that takes place inside this town, administrators and educators of this public school are keenly aware of the divide in the town and are working tirelessly to ensure the safety and success of every student. Positive interactions between educators and even the toughest students are commonplace and genuine. There are also precautions in place, hall monitors, staff training, to ensure that troubles outside the school don't find their way into the school. And another way they do that is by enacting the zero tolerance policy, which is adopted out of necessity, and its continued enforcement maintains the safety and success of the school. Review the information. A thorough review and prioritization of the known facts, parties involved, and the impact on the community will provide an increased ability to identify possible solutions using ethical and legal decision making. There are a number of people that could be affected by this situation, and the resulting solution, perceptions of the staff and school district as a whole will be in jeopardy regardless of the outcome. Some will say that the punishment was too firm, some will say it was too lenient. The school district is faced with an administrator that clearly ignored policy. That administrator, Richard, has had his hand forced one way or another. Parents will want fair punishment. Fellow staff members will want to see the judgment of an administrator taken into consideration. Finally, the students just want to know how this applies to the future. The path to resolving this particular scenario is burdened with situationally specific details and a lack of previous adjudications to use an example to follow. In this situation, ethical struggle meets firm adherence to operational policies and procedures. Adherence to those policies is in the past have seen occurrences such as this decline in number. However, what is the cost of removing ethical interpretation for David and for future Davids? Is this how we want to model ethical behavior in our personal conduct and our relationships? Options and consequences. It's imperative to analyze the options in terms of established ethical frameworks in order to determine how firm the response should be. One option is taking no action. Richard will have formal reprimand in his file, but David would remain in school. There would be objections from some people saying that discrimination was involved because the zero tolerance policy was not followed. That could set a poor precedent for future similar situations. I see this as an option, but not the best. A firm approach to the situation calls for strict adherence to policy guidelines and eliminates the need to make future decisions on a case-by-case basis, and that protects the school district from being faced with charges of discrimination in this incident and in future incidents. This course of action would leave David with 45 days in the AEP, but he would be able to recover with continued good behavior and hard work. An alternative option includes asking to meet with the superintendent and district board in order to find a compromise that would still uphold the policy, but it takes David's level of involvement into consideration. This would ease the burden on Richard and possibly lighten the punishment for David. It might, however, leave the door open for future decisions to be considered in a case-by-case manner. I see this as a good option. In order to demonstrate my capacity to evaluate the ethical dimensions of issues, I must look at the pros and cons for each option and help narrow down the selections. Pros for inaction. David stays in class. Richard stands up for his reasoning. Modeling of ethics over blind adherence to policy. Cons. Professional fallout for Richard. Modeling a lack of faith in policies and procedures. Possibly discriminatory. Sets a precedent for others to ignore policies in the future. We don't want those. Firm action. Pros. Affirms the legitimacy of the policies and procedures. Upholds fair interpretation and implementation of policy. Eliminates discrimination. Eliminates possible negative precedent for future incidents. And helps Richard remain in good standing with the district. Cons. David spends time in the AEP. Zero display of ethical interpretation and analysis of the situation. Attempted compromise. Pros. Affirms legitimacy of policy. Upholds fair interpretation. reduces discrimination, helps Richard remain in good standing. It introduces ethical interpretation and fair judgment into adjudication process, allows the superintendent and school board to assist and add clout to the decision, provides fair punishment for the level of involvement. However, the cons: possible professional fallout for Richard, sets precedent for future administrators, staff, and students to form alternate interpretations of policy. Punishment for David still remains. However, in order to make a final decision about which option cultivates ethical behavior in others, a comprehensive reflection is necessary and will ultimately lead to the solution that fits best. My experiences in the military ingrained in me a philosophy of strict adherence to policy and procedure. Initially, my heart was set on accepting the advice of the director and proceeding with zero tolerance policy, which would have been tough on David, but would have maintained law and order. However, after a diligent look at every course of action, I look at the potential compromise as the best option overall. There will be fallout and negative feelings, but the possibility of finding good outcome for everyone involved far outweigh those negatives. Richard will make the director mad by going above his head and could create some tension between the two. However, that tension can be overcome with respect and a positive working influence or relationship following the incident. Some could see the compromise as a direct violation of the zero tolerance policy, but with a sound explanation and a review of facts, many will acknowledge the need for a softer stance on this particular situation. In order to cultivate ethical behavior in the future, a unified and ethical stance on this issue is necessary. When you add compassion and logic into the response for David's little involvement, you give an already positive educational environment the school has worked so diligently to develop. Students and staff will see empathy and therefore adopt it. They also see logic, reason, and ethics as driving factors behind making tough decisions instead of just blindly following orders. All right. Should the compromise fail, Richard will have his line in the sand, followed his moral compass, and fought for what he thought was right. Implemented the decision, the path I chose doesn't come without reservation. In fact, it challenges some of my core beliefs. However, as a result of my honest attempts to grow as a leader in educational environment, I've chosen to adopt a variation of those core beliefs I hold most dear by petitioning for a compromise. The proposed compromise would consist of respectfully asking for a meeting with the superintendent. When accepted, I would invite the director to participate in that meeting in order to avoid feelings of betrayal or perceived malice. I would detail the incident, my concerns, and my fully developed alternative course of action. That course of action would clearly recognize David's violation of policy. However, I would also introduce the human aspect of the situation by highlighting David's fear of retribution as a compelling factor in his initial reaction. James's history of violence towards other students will only help illustrate David's fear as a legitimate reaction to the situation. Based on those factors, I would present an alternative punishment in the form of a 1-week in-school suspension for David, which highlights the gravity of the violation. He's still being suspended, but also provides an ethically sound punishment which fits his crime. If the superintendent accepts, I would bring it in front of his parents with a meeting to discuss the details, and if not, I would petition to see it in front of the school board. All I would do is do the same thing that I explained to the superintendent in front of the school board. Hopefully, they would take a vote on it and say whether or not they support me. Now, following my meeting with the school board, if they decided not to accept it, I would just fall back on the firm stance plan, because you have to agree, you have to have a united force, you have to present all of the information, and you have to draw your line in the sand. And if you don't do that, then what are you doing? You can't do it. You have to have a united front. Following the meeting, I wouldn't share it a whole lot with the staff. I would just say that as a result of a comprehensive review of the facts, the administrators decided on whatever level of punishment that adequately address the violations of the policies, and there is no need to detail how that decision was made, only that it was accomplished by teamwork and an ethical approach to adjudicating the incident. This models ethical behavior and cultivates future ethical behaviors in others. Thank you for your time. That's all I got.